and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Jang-cho. The second summit between the U.S. and North Korea is confirmed. Today, we discuss the future course of this top-down, leader-to-leader diplomacy.
Just a little bit ago, the president had about an hour-and-a-half long meeting. It was productive, and they're going to continue those conversations.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Eric Brewer, visiting fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Mr. Brewer was the Director for Counterproliferation at the National Security Council. He played a lead role coordinating the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy on North Korea. Also joining me today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, President of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Now, North Korea's lead negotiator, Kim Young-chul, came to the United States. What's his mission?
Well, I think his mission is quite simple, and it's to have a meeting with President Trump and to deliver the letter that that report suggests that he has, and to secure a second summit with the president and Kim Jong-un. I think another meeting we should all be interested in is the meeting apparently taking place between Cho Sun-hui and Steve Biegun. This could be potentially the first in a series of working level discussions. I think we should hope that that's what comes out of that, because that's what's been missing from this diplomatic push so far, is that series of substantive talks at the working level in order to try and put some meat on the bones to what the leaders agreed to in Singapore.
Mm-hmm. So Special Representative Biegun went to greet Kim Young-chul at the airport. Do we see him becoming more important in the process?
Well, I think the president has signaled his confidence in Biegun. You may remember that over the Christmas break, the president tweeted out a photograph meeting with my Korea team. And there was a picture of Steve Biegun there in the Oval Office. So I think we're finally beginning to see Biegun put into a more operational role, both in terms of greeting this senior VIP visitor, but also now jetting off to Stockholm. And I think it's a very good thing, as was mentioned. I think we need to be seeing the working level talks. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get meaningful progress through the summitry process.
Mm-hmm. So in the lead up to the summit, for the U.S. side, what is the key objective?
So, I think one of the things that I would be looking for, right, to sort of define success, I would say, a couple of things. One, I think what we got to make sure is that diplomacy stays on track. I think there's always a risk in these sorts of forums, given North Korea's past behavior, that something occurs that sort of craters diplomacy. And so I think above all, we have to make sure that stays on track. I think the other thing we have to do as well is to get off of this sort of trajectory that we're on, that Frank alluded to a second ago, which is whereby we sort of, Kim pretends to give up his nuclear weapons and we pretend to believe him, right? I think we have to move beyond leaping from summit to summit and to as clear as we can be in whatever statement or declaration comes out of this next meeting, that from here on out, we need to kick it down to that more substantive level to have those discussions. And the next summit doesn't need to occur until there's something for those leaders to agree on. I think that is really more so than really making a lot of headway on denuclearization. I think we need to firm up that process that can actually get us there, rather than look for big leaps in either direction.
Mm-hmm. So, Frank, do you think the U.S. side actually told Pyongyang that you need to have working level talks in order to have the next summit?
Well, the sequencing of the steps here, the dance moves, is really important. And yet we know that there's still many details yet to be worked out. Otherwise, these working level talks that really only just kicking off between Biegun and his counterpart would have taken place weeks ago. So they are putting some of the high-level agreement first, and leaving a lot of the details to be worked out between now and when the summit actually happens. So as a process guy, that worries me a little bit, because basically the North Koreans know that the summit's going to happen, and we're counting on good faith from them to negotiate those details between now and whenever the meeting takes place. On the other hand, I strongly agree with this notion that keeping the diplomatic dance going is half the battle, and we want to avoid a breakdown. So this high-level meeting suggests that the North came with something substantive, and probably the U.S. also has prepared something substantive in return.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think Kim Young-chul has brought to the United States?
So I think he probably put some additional details on some of the offers that have already been floated, would be my guess, right? I mean, there's been plenty of things discussed so far, ranging from allowing observers into the nuclear and missile test sites to shutting down Yongbyon, and he also might have provided some additional ways that North Korea could provide information on its nuclear facilities, making progress towards that declaration, or at least pathways by which those different things could be achieved. So I think there's lots of different options that he could have put on the table. But again, I would be cautious against the idea that he's putting something out there that is a major breakthrough or is a firm commitment with a lot of details towards denuclearization, because I just don't think that's likely quite yet.
Mm-hmm. And Vice President Pence this week said he's still waiting for North Korea's concrete steps to denuclearization. What kind of concrete steps is the U.S. waiting for?
Well, I think what we saw over the last few weeks, the U.S. sending a signal through the relaxation of humanitarian aid provisions, trying to induce the North to move beyond what they've done so far. Because what they've done so far with the Pyongyang and other steps to sort of symbolically commit themselves to a process of denuclearization falls far short of what we're going to need to see. I think the specifics will have to be worked out, obviously, but we're looking at things like fissile material production. We're looking at objectives like halting the production of highly enriched uranium and plutonium at Yongbyon. Eventually, you're going to need the kind of inventory of all the nuclear facilities that was mentioned. But I think we will have to accept that process of getting clarity and the specific steps is going to take time. And it's not going to happen all at once either. There's a lot of experience in the U.S. government here at the table on the denuclearization process with Iran and the many phases that were required to try to begin to make progress on that very difficult challenge. North Korea is going to be even tougher.
Mm-hmm. In terms of what we are looking for, are there signs that the United States is becoming more flexible on receiving the declaration list from North Korea?
I think so. I mean, that was one of the initial asks that the United States has a priority. I still think perhaps it has slipped into the background somewhat. I think we've taken what is a more realistic proposition that we don't need a complete list of all those facilities up front. That we're then going to start the process of verifying that this list is entirely correct, because North Korea doesn't want to provide that list. And frankly, trying to verify all of that in one fell swoop could just bog down negotiations. I think a more realistic process is a phased approach to that declaration, whereby, for example, we start on perhaps a list of fissile material production facilities, and then work our way up to warhead manufacturing and missile facilities. And meanwhile, while that's running its course, we can also engage in other efforts on denuclearization and reciprocal measures. So I think the United States has probably backed off its insistence that be provided up front, but I don't think at the end of the day we've backed off the requirement that in order to finally reach denuclearization and to have a deal, we're going to need to know about all of North Korea's nuclear capabilities.
This is a really critical point, because if the United States were to insist up front on a complete 100% thorough inventory of all of North Korea's missile facilities, nuclear facilities, fissile material production facilities, it's really an invitation to a train wreck, because I can guarantee you that there would be things missing from that list. There would be things on that list that we didn't expect. And then you get bogged down in trying to rectify and clarify this multi-hundred-page document instead of going about the business of managing the risk that we're facing from North Korean nuclear weapons. So I strongly hope that the U.S. is doing exactly as suggested, that they're beginning to break that inventory down into phases based on the highest priority items first. That probably means fissile material production and Yongbyon, and then you move systematically toward a complete inventory.
Mm-hmm. Do you see signs that U.S. is softening negotiation position stance against North Korea?
So I think we've seen an evolution in aspects of the U.S. position over time. One of the ways in which it's changed, I think, is the U.S. has moved off of this idea that denuclearization is going to happen quickly or immediately, right? I think early on there was the Libya model was floated whereby it's this very quick process whereby the U.S. and its partners come in and all of the stuff comes out. I think we've moved off of that a little bit. I think the president himself has even said that he's not in a hurry, that this doesn't need to occur overnight. So I think that's actually a good evolution because I think that reflects reality, right? It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a long process. I think one of the other areas where we've seen a bit of a shift is, again, on this idea that sanctions relief will only come once denuclearization is achieved. There's been a couple of recent interviews where Secretary Pompeo has declined to reaffirm that policy. And again, with some of the recent relaxation in restrictions that had limited humanitarian aid and assistance, I think that position is evolving, which again, I think is a positive evolution because realistically, in order to make any headway on denuclearization, we are going to have to provide some sort of sanctions relief along the way that of course should be on par with the measures that North Korea takes, but it is not realistic to try and wait that out into the end. So these, I think, I see as positive evolutions in the U.S. negotiating position.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Pompeo in recent interviews said that the objective of talking to North Korea is the security of the American people. And in South Korea, this is interpreted as U.S. will only discuss ICBM at the next round of talks. So is this the right way to interpret this?
I think that's a misinterpretation. I think that it's natural that Secretary Pompeo would affirm for the American people that these talks are ultimately about American security. Otherwise, why are we there? We're not there only for the security of our ally. We're also there to make ourselves safer. But in doing that, we're not going to abandon South Korea's interests or Japanese interests, for that matter. Both of our treaty allies have unique priorities on the peninsula. In South Korea, the conventional forces balance matters. The peace and stability on the peninsula matters. For Japan, medium-range missiles, short-range missiles, conventional missiles, not just nuclear missiles, matter a lot, as do the abduction of Japanese citizens. So I think the United States will take all of those interests into account in negotiating with the North. But I think it's very natural that Secretary Pompeo would try to remind the American people that at the end of the day, this is not America doing a favor for an ally. This is America pursuing its own national security interests as well. And I think that's absolutely appropriate statement by the Secretary.
And I think he's also trying to broaden the aperture of how we define success in these negotiations as well. Recognizing that denuclearization as the end goal is still a long ways out there. I think, the president, although he has talked a lot about the importance of North Korea not conducting missile tests and not conducting nuclear tests, I think by trying to redefine a little bit how we would define success in this process and focusing on reducing the threat to the American people leaves them open a little bit more to I think, again, ahead of the United States election, point to some more concrete measures that we've achieved as part of this process. So it's a part of political calculation as well.
Mm-hmm. So what should be the minimum achievement from the second summit? So
I think, first and foremost, again, trying to keep diplomacy on track and ensuring that we have a process that comes out of this. I think getting North Korea's commitment to have that working level dialogue and letting that drive the development of a roadmap towards denuclearization. I think, again, that could potentially be the biggest success, not some really pie in the sky idea of denuclearization. But I also think, to Frank's earlier point, I think we also have to avoid a potential situation in which President Trump gives concessions to the North Koreans that I think many would see as in excess of what should be provided for North Korean commitments. I think there's a real risk that takes place. And so I think we need to work to avoid that to the extent possible.
So, Eric, what do you think was in Kim Jong-un's letter that was delivered to President Trump?
So I think if history is any guide on this topic, I think there was a lot of probably praise for President Trump for the courage that he has showed in embarking on this diplomatic process, and a lot of probably attempts to keep President Trump and Kim Jong-un on the same plane level, and probably trying to reaffirm them as in this together. And we can do this, we can achieve this vision as long as we stick to our commitments and stick to this vision. I think that's probably what has generated success so far for Kim Jong-un, and so I think we should suspect it's those similar themes in this letter that Kim Jong-chol is delivering.
Well, we'll end our conversation here and watch video for our next topic.
우리 시대를 대표할 대상 건설들을 최상의 수준에서 완공하여야 합니다.
The completion of Chairman Kim's priority project, Wonsan-Galma Tourist Zone, has been pushed back due to international sanctions. North Korea's trade deficit with China last year also hit a record high. Now, Frank, Kim Jong-un continues to delay the deadline for completing the Wonsan-Galma tourist area and also the Yangdeok Hot Springs resort. So that's because North Korea couldn't import in the materials for interior designs. So do you think North Korea is currently having difficulty importing construction materials because of the international sanctions?
Well, the evidence is really mixed. On the one hand, you see very stable rice prices in North Korea with very little fluctuation. And rice is sort of a good proxy for currency in North Korea because it's a common staple that is exchanged across the whole country. So we don't see evidence of distress in the North Korean economy. On the other hand, as you point out, certain key materials are clearly having a tougher time making their way into North Korea. You can still get luxury scotch on the shelves, and the Mercedes vehicles somehow find a way in. But we know from lots of evidence that North Korea is having a difficulty importing certain key goods. So how much of an impediment is this for Chairman Kim? He wants to deliver economic benefits for the people. It's a top priority for him. To the extent that he now is being frustrated in some of those ambitions, I think it gives us a little bit of leverage in the denuclearization talks. But I wouldn't want to overstate it because you look around the country, there is growth, there is new construction, a lot of it fueled by Chinese investment. Tourists are coming to North Korea from China. So it's put a crimp in his plans, but it hasn't crippled them.
Mm-hmm. Eric, what's your take? How much is the pain?
So I think North Korea is no doubt still feeling the bite of international sanctions. There's still pain there. But I think it's less now than it was perhaps at the beginning of 2018. I think a lot of the pressure that was added throughout 2017, you had a lot of new UN Security Council resolutions that really upped the sectoral sanctions. You had increases in enforcement, particularly from China. And so I think that went a long way into creating, I think, levels of pressure on Kim Jong-un that weren't previously there. So I think what we've seen, though, since 2018, some of those trends have reversed. And I think while sanctions are still there on paper, of course, I think a lot of the momentum and some of the foundations that supported that maximum pressure effort have eroded. I think we've seen some evidence that China has slackened in sanctions enforcement. Obviously, South Korean policy towards the North has changed to emphasizing the development of political and economic ties. And I think perhaps most importantly, President Trump's own change towards Kim Jong-un and the embrace of him as this co-equal and counterpart has sort of sucked the wind out of the sails of the maximum pressure campaign, if you will. And we've even seen the president himself say that he doesn't like the term maximum pressure because North Korea and the United States are getting along. So I think sanctions are still there, but I think the trajectory of them potentially getting worse is less now. And I think that probably influences Kim Jong-un's thinking and what he's willing to agree to at the table.
So Eric, at the White House, you coordinated Trump administration's maximum pressure policy on North Korea. So when we get into the details, some people say that we should target the elites of North Korea and the luxury goods. What do you think?
So I think the sanctions and targeting the elites and luxury goods is a part of that. It is an important part. But I think ultimately what we saw have the biggest impact and what's more important is the strong sanctions against the way that North Korea generates revenue and its oil export capacity. And so I think all of that has a role to play, but I think really looking towards the strong enforcement of those sectoral sanctions, I think is more important in producing the type of strategic effect that you're looking for in potentially changing Kim Jong-un's calculus. And look, don't get me wrong, I think it's highly unlikely that any level of pressure is going to cause him to decide to give up his nuclear weapons. The question is, though, between that policy objective and where we are now, what can we achieve? And I think there's a lot of unexplored territory there, and I'm worried that as time goes on, the pressure lessens and we're less likely to achieve a positive outcome for us.
Well, I think Eric is to be commended, for your work in helping to orchestrate the maximum pressure campaign. But as you have just said, the pressure campaign was a means to an end. And the goal was to get these negotiations moving and then to maintain sufficient pressure to ensure that we'll have continued progress. And so I think the maximum pressure campaign essentially has ended. I think it's unlikely to be fully restored absent some horrific North Korean return to more provocative behavior. But I'm not sure that that's lamentable. We need pressure to aid our diplomats in their work. But the max pressure campaign, to some extent, has served its purpose. Now we see border crossings with China, 5 of them being upgraded. We see deeper Chinese investment. We see north-south economic relations potentially heating up. This is part of a peace process. It's to be commended rather than lamented as long as we get progress on denuclearization.
I think that's where we disagree, right? I think as we see this pressure lessen, I think we're less likely to get a type of deal that the United States and its allies might find acceptable. And I also worry too that given the lessening pressure, should diplomacy collapse, which is highly undesirable, what is Plan B? What do we go back to? Because I think the idea that the United States is going to be able to easily or quickly pivot back to a maximum pressure approach is highly unlikely because the underlying conditions are no longer there. So then what happens? And so I think we do need to prepare for these alternative scenarios.
Yeah, well, that leaves us a lot to think about going forward. And we'll leave it here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a propaganda poster released by North Korea this week. The poster says, "Let's expand cooperation between the North and South so that the entire Korean people can benefit from the improvement in ties." We also see from the picture cruise ship that says Mount Kumgang and buses that connect North Korea's Siniju with South Korea's Busan. Frank?
Well, there's propaganda designed for external consumption and internal consumption, and this is clearly an external consumption message of peace and light to the South. It's nice to see. It says something about the North's ambitions to promote North-South ties. Internally, they still have posters that show the barrel of a gun being the method to unification. So I think we need to be cautious about taking propaganda posters like this at face value, and remember that we're still dealing with a dangerous adversary that has not abandoned the potential ambition of unification through force.
Mm-hmm. Eric?
I agree with Frank, and I think this sort of brings to mind what has been sort of I think a larger attempt by Kim Jong-un since early 2018, which is just sort of shift to sort of an effort at normalization, right? Normalization of relations with South Korea, normalization of relations with China, projecting North Korea as a normal state, and to sort of drive this larger objective, I think, of acceptance of status quo and of its nuclear arsenal. And so I sort of see this as part and parcel of that effort.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Jannuzi, Mr. Brewer, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.